I held him within 5 minutes of him being born.
Are you surprised by the love you feel for baby Eric?
I actually said to Lauren beforehand, what if I liked the dogs more than him?
Picture this. A 6-year-old boy sits alone in his bedroom, tears streaming down his face, whispering the same 3 words his father has never said to him. I'm proud of you. Fast forward 6 decades, and that same boy has become the most powerful man in television history. Yet those 3 words still echo in empty rooms, haunting every achievement, every triumph, every moment of supposed victory. This is not the Simon Cowell story you think you know. This isn't about the sharp suits, the cutting remarks, or the billion-dollar empire. This is about a man whose greatest fear wasn't failure. It was remaining invisible. And how that fear drove him to heights that nearly destroyed everything he touched, including himself. What I'm about to share with you will change how you see every judge, every critique, every moment of television history he's created. Because behind those infamous words, "It's a no from me," lies a story so heartbreaking, so raw, that it makes every harsh verdict suddenly make sense. Before we dive into the depths of this journey, if Simon's shows ever moved you, inspired you, or broke your heart, hit that like button. Because what you're about to discover is the real story behind the man who spent his life searching for the one thing fame could never give him. London, 1959. While most children are learning their first words, Simon Philip Cowell is learning his first lesson in disappointment. Not from the world outside, but from the people who were supposed to love him most. His mother, Julie Brett, moves through their Hertfordshire home like a ghost in ballet slippers. Graceful, untouchable, emotionally unreachable. A former dancer who had traded stages for society, she carries herself with the kind of elegance that keeps even her own son at arm's length. Every attempt at affection feels like reaching for smoke, but it's his father's silence that cuts deepest. Eric Philip Cowell, successful music executive, property developer, a man who understands the language of business but remains fluent in emotional distance. Picture young Simon, desperate for just one moment of approval, one acknowledgement that he matters, that he exists in his father's world of achievements and expectations. "My father never said he was proud of me," Simon would confess decades later, his voice carrying the same ache that 6-year-old boy felt every night before sleep. "Even when I needed it most." This wasn't just parental neglect. This was the blueprint for a lifetime of seeking validation from strangers because he couldn't get it from family. Every report card brought home, every small victory celebrated alone, every milestone marked only by his own recognition. In a house filled with success and social standing, Simon was learning the most dangerous lesson of all, that love had to be earned, and apparently he hadn't earned it yet. If home was a desert of affection, school became an ocean of mediocrity where Simon learned to drown quietly. Radlett Preparatory School, then Dover College. Prestigious names that promised greatness but delivered only more evidence of his apparent inadequacy. He wasn't the star athlete. He wasn't the brilliant scholar. He wasn't the charismatic leader. He was just there. Present but unremarkable, existing in that cruel space where you're visible enough to know you don't matter, but invisible enough that no one bothers to help you change it. His classmates moved through their days with the confidence of those who belonged. Simon moved through his with the weight of knowing he didn't. Every lesson became a reminder that he was falling short of some invisible standard. Every friendship felt temporary, conditional, like it could evaporate the moment someone better came along. When he finally scraped through with only 2 GCE passes, English and sociology, it wasn't relief he felt walking away from Dover College. It was the crushing confirmation of what he'd suspected all along. He was destined for disappointment. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of childhood struggle. Simon didn't just accept his fate. Instead, he began building something else entirely. A defense mechanism so powerful it would one day reshape the entertainment industry. He was learning to judge others before they could judge him. to spot weaknesses before they could expose his own, to control narratives before they could control him. The boy who felt invisible was already sketching the blueprint for becoming impossible to ignore. MI Music, 1979. Picture a 20-year-old Simon Cowell, tie slightly askew, carrying coffee to producers whose names would outlast their faces, sorting fan mail for artists whose voices filled stadiums while his own voice went unheard in meetings where his presence barely registered. This wasn't just a job, it was purgatory with a paycheck. Every morning he'd watch executives stride past him like he was furniture, discussing deals worth millions, while he organized their correspondence. The cruelest part? He was working in music, the industry he was desperate to conquer, but from the lowest possible vantage point. I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight, he'd recall years later, and you can hear the ghost of that young man's desperation in every word. But humiliation has a strange power. It can either break you completely or forge you into something unbreakable. For Simon, those mailroom days became a masterclass in the mechanics of power. He studied not just what made songs successful, but what made people successful. Who got remembered and who got forgotten. Who commanded rooms and who disappeared into them. He left EMI once, ran away from the humiliation when it became too much to bear. But the world outside offered nothing but more rejection, more doors slamming shut, more evidence that maybe his father was right to never say he was proud. So he crawled back, tail between his legs, to the same mailroom he'd once scorned. Those were the days when he'd cry quietly in bathroom stalls after work, not just from failure, but from the terrifying thought that this might be as good as it gets. That the boy who'd grown up feeling like he didn't matter might become a man who actually didn't matter. But something else was happening in those tears, something crucial. Simon was learning the most valuable lesson of his life. Rejection isn't the end of your story. It's the raw material for rewriting it entirely. By 1980, Simon had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If the music industry wouldn't make room for him, he'd make room for himself. With borrowed money and borrowed courage, he launched Fanfare Records with his partner, Ian Burton. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the universe was finally ready to apologize for 2 decades of disappointment. So, Macho by Sunita became a hit that nobody saw coming, especially not Simon. Suddenly, the invisible boy was hosting parties, shaking hands with people who'd once looked through him like glass, tasting success for the first time in his life. The champagne was sweet. The validation was sweeter. After years of carrying other people's dreams, Simon was finally living his own. But success, especially early success, can be the most dangerous drug of all. It makes you believe you've figured out the formula when you've only gotten lucky. It makes you think the universe owes you more of the same when the universe owes you nothing at all. By the late 1980s, the music industry had shifted beneath Simon's feet like tectonic plates. What worked yesterday became irrelevant today. Trends died overnight, and Fanfare Records, his dream, his proof that he mattered, crumbled into bankruptcy with the kind of spectacular failure that makes headlines for all the wrong reasons. Imagine being 30 years old and moving back into the same bedroom where you once cried yourself to sleep as a child, feeling worthless and unseen. Except now you're not just carrying the weight of potential failure, you're carrying the concrete evidence of actual failure. Simon's parents' house in the early 1990s became a museum of disappointed dreams. Every familiar corner whispered reminders of what he'd been before fame briefly kissed his cheek, and what he'd become after it walked away. The boy who'd once felt invisible had become a man who was visible for all the wrong reasons, as someone who'd had his shot and missed. That time nearly broke me, he'd admit years later, and you can hear in those words the sound of a soul scraping bottom, wondering if rock bottom has a basement. But here's where Simon's story becomes something extraordinary. Instead of staying broken, he used that brokenness as building material. Every sleepless night became a classroom. Every moment of humiliation became data. Every whispered conversation about his failure became fuel for a comeback that nobody, not even Simon himself, could have imagined. He began studying the industry not as someone who wanted to join it, but as someone who wanted to understand it so completely that he could reshape it entirely. He watched not just what succeeded, but why it succeeded. Not just who got famous, but how they got famous. Not just what the critics loved, but what ordinary people actually bought. And in that difference, that gap between critical acclaim and commercial success, Simon found his future. When Simon returned to the music industry in the early 1990s through BMG, he wasn't the same man who'd left. The failure of fanfare had burned away his romantic notions about art and authenticity. What remained was something harder, more practical, and infinitely more powerful. The understanding that the masses, not the critics, determine success. While industry insiders sneered at manufactured pop groups, Simon signed 5. While purists mocked the concept of celebrity covers albums, he made fortunes with Robson and Jerome. The year everything changed. Not just for Simon, but for television itself. Pop Idol premiered, and with it came something the medium had never seen before: a judge who refused to lie. For decades, television had operated on a foundation of polite deception. Contestants were told they were interesting when they were terrible, unique when they were generic, just not what we're looking for right now when they should have been told to find a different dream entirely. Simon shattered that tradition with 3 simple words: "I don't like you." The audience gasped. The other judges squirmed. The contestants often cried, but something extraordinary happened. People couldn't look away. Because finally, someone was saying what everyone at home was thinking. Finally, someone was treating the audience like adults who could handle the truth. Finally, someone understood that kindness isn't always kind. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is save someone from wasting years chasing a dream they'll never catch. What they called cruelty, Simon would explain later, the audience called honesty. And they were right, because buried in every harsh critique was something precious: respect. Respect for the craft that demanded excellence. Respect for the audience that deserved authenticity. Respect for the truth, even when, especially when, it hurt. By 2005, Simon Cowell wasn't just famous, he was a force of nature. American Idol had conquered the United States. The X Factor was dominating the UK. Got Talent was spreading across the globe like a cultural virus, reaching more than 600 million viewers in over 100 countries. He had become what he'd always dreamed of, impossible to ignore. But dreams achieved can be more dangerous than dreams deferred. Because success at that level doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes your soul. And not always for the better. The same bluntness that made him beloved made him reviled. The same honesty that audiences craved made him a target for every critic who thought he'd gone too far. He was booed in public, mocked in tabloids, painted as a villain by people who saw only the cruelty and missed entirely the conviction behind it. "I knew people hated me," he'd confess years later. "But I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." And there it is, the tragedy of authenticity. When you refuse to wear masks, people blame you for having a face they don't like. When you insist on truth in a world built on comfortable lies, you become the villain in other people's stories. The higher Simon climbed, the more isolated he became. Success filled his bank accounts but emptied his personal life. Friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the intensity he brought to everything. Romances crumbled under the weight of his relentless schedule and even more relentless standards. The boy who'd once been starved of affection had become a man starved of peace. The ultimate irony, he'd gained the whole world's attention, but lost the ability to simply be present in a quiet room with someone he loved. The scandal that changed everything. 2013. The year Simon Cowell learned that even the most powerful man in television couldn't control every story, especially when that story was his own life exploding in real time. The headlines screamed betrayal. Simon Cowell expecting a child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew. Overnight, the man who'd built his empire on judging others found himself judged by the entire world. This wasn't just gossip, it was a reckoning. Every tabloid became a courtroom. Every interview became a trial. Every public appearance became an examination of character under the harshest possible light. For a man who'd spent his career controlling narratives, the complete loss of control was devastating. Friends turned away. Trust evaporated. The empire he'd built on certainty suddenly felt like it was constructed on quicksand. It wasn't something I was proud of, he'd admit later, and you can hear in those words the sound of a man who'd finally encountered something his wealth and power couldn't fix: his own conscience. But sometimes destruction is the only path to construction. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. The Miracle of Fatherhood, February 14th, 2014, Valentine's Day. The day Simon Cowell met the one critic who would matter more than all the others combined, his son, Eric. When he held that tiny boy for the first time, something shifted in Simon's universe. The man who'd spent his life seeking validation from strangers suddenly found it in the unconditional gaze of someone who didn't care about ratings or revenue, who didn't know about scandals or successes, who loved him simply because he existed. My world wasn't about ratings or contracts anymore, he'd say later. It was about him. For the first time in his life, Simon discovered what it meant to be needed, not for what he could provide, but for who he was. Every midnight feeding, every diaper change, every quiet moment in the nursery became a masterclass in presence, in being fully there for another human being without expecting anything in return. The transformation was visible to everyone who knew him. The sharp edges softened. The impatience became patience. The need to control everything gave way to the simple joy of being controlled by love. But redemption never comes without scars. The scandal had left wounds that even fatherhood couldn't completely heal. The loss of friendships, the erosion of trust, the weight of guilt that no amount of lullabies could entirely lift. Yet, in holding his son, Simon discovered something he'd been searching for since childhood: proof that he was worthy of unconditional love. Not love earned through achievements or acquisitions, but love given freely, completely, permanently. The Loss of Anchors, 2015. Just as Simon was learning to navigate fatherhood, life reminded him how quickly everything can change. His mother, Julie Brett, passed away at 89, taking with her the last living witness to his childhood, the last person who'd known him before he became famous, before he became powerful, before he became the man the world either loved or hated. The grief was overwhelming, but it was complicated by something even more painful: regret. Because Julie's death came 16 years after his father's passing in 1999, which meant both parents had died carrying conversations that would never happen, carrying words that would never be spoken, carrying the complex love of a family that had never quite learned how to express it. For a man who'd built his career on decisive moments and clear verdicts, the ambiguity was torturous. Had they been proud of him? Had they understood him? Had they loved him in ways they couldn't express, or had he simply never been enough? The funeral was private, but the grieving was public. Everyone could see that something had shifted in Simon: a gentleness, a vulnerability, a new awareness of how quickly the people we love can slip away from us. Losing my mom was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, he'd admit. And you can hear in those words the sound of a son who'd finally run out of time to earn the approval he'd always craved. The accident that almost ended everything. August 8th, 2020. 6 p.m., Malibu. Simon Cowell, testing a new electric bike in his courtyard, experiences a moment that will redefine the rest of his life. 1 second of miscalculation, 1 moment of overconfidence, 1 instant where gravity reminds even the most powerful man on television that some forces can't be controlled. The fall shattered his back in multiple places, 6 hours of surgery, a steel rod implanted in his spine, doctors delivering the kind of news that makes everything else irrelevant. He'd come within a minute of not making it at all. I came within a minute of not making it, he'd later recall. And those words carry the weight of every near miss, every close call, every reminder that life hangs by threads so thin we pretend they don't exist. For a man who defined himself through control, the complete loss of it was devastating. He couldn't sit without agony. He couldn't walk without assistance. He couldn't pick up his son without pain screaming through his spine. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological terror. What if Eric lost his father too soon? What if all the bedtime stories went unread? All the bike rides untaken? All the quiet moments of connection were cut short by fate's cruelest timing? I thought of Eric and I knew I had to fight, he'd confess. And in those words you can hear something extraordinary. A man discovering that love isn't just something you feel, but something you choose. Again and again, even when choosing it means choosing pain. The recovery was brutal. Each step felt like climbing mountains. Each day without filming felt like failure. But slowly, agonizingly, he rebuilt himself not just physically but spiritually, discovering strength in vulnerability, power in admitting weakness, victory in simply surviving. Then, as if the universe wasn't finished teaching him about fragility, came the second accident in 2022. Another bike, another fall, another hospital stay. This time it was his arm that shattered, his face that bruised, his pride that took the hardest hit. To be knocked down once is tragedy. To be knocked down twice feels like punishment. But Simon refused to see it that way. Instead, he chose to see it as education. Painful, expensive education about what really matters when everything else falls away. The face he couldn't control. Throughout the 2010s, as Simon's power grew and his influence expanded, he'd been fighting a quieter battle against his own reflection. But by 2021, the armor had become a prison. Fans stared in shock at a man who no longer looked like himself. His features seemed frozen, his expressions limited, his trademark smirk buried under layers of medical intervention. The headlines were brutal. Simon Cowell. What happened to his face? The memes were merciless. The public judgment was immediate and unforgiving. For a man who'd built an empire on controlling appearances, his own and others, the complete loss of that control was devastating. I looked in the mirror and literally didn't recognize myself, he'd admit. And you can hear in those words the sound of someone who'd lost not just their appearance, but their identity. The solution required the same courage he'd always demanded from contestants. The courage to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Simon stopped the procedures, abandoned the quest for artificial youth, and chose authenticity over illusion. When he emerged from that decision, it wasn't with the glossy perfection of digital enhancement, but with something more valuable. The honest face of a man who'd learned that the greatest courage isn't in hiding from time, but in accepting what it teaches you. The death that broke him. September 2024. The phone call that changes everything. Liam Payne, the boy Simon had first met at 16, nervous but determined, carrying a voice full of unshakable promise, was gone. Not after decades of stages and sunsets, but violently suddenly at only 31 years old. For millions of fans, the news was shocking. For Simon, it was devastating in a way that words couldn't hold. Liam wasn't just another contestant, another star in a catalog of discoveries. He was family. The boy Simon had placed in one direction, the young man he'd watched grow from teenager to superstar to troubled soul, struggling with demons that fame couldn't exorcise. Simon remembered that first audition, the nervous laugh, the flicker of determination in young Liam's eyes. A simple yes had unlocked a journey that seemed destined to last decades. To see that journey cut short so abruptly, so violently, so unnecessarily, Simon would later say it was like losing a son. The funeral was private, but the grieving was universal. Cities glowed with candlelight vigils. Social media flooded with lyrics, photos, and broken words of disbelief. But Simon's mourning was solitary, personal, marked not by public statements, but by the simple act of holding his own son closer, reading bedtime stories with new urgency, cherishing every laugh as if it might be finite. It was as if he was trying to give Eric every moment Liam would never get, one friend observed. And in that behavior, you can see the true measure of how deeply the loss cut. Liam's death didn't just grieve Simon, it educated him. It became the mirror he couldn't avoid, showing him the cost of fame, the brevity of life, the truth that even the brightest lights can be extinguished without warning. The man at 65. Today, Simon Cowell sits in his Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by the symbols of success but defined by something entirely different: survival. At 65, his body tells the story of every battle he's fought. His spine, held together by steel, reminds him daily that control is an illusion. His vision, dimmed by years under harsh lights and the lingering effects of trauma, requires constant adaptation. His morning routine reads like a medical regimen. Careful Pilates to protect his fragile spine, prescription medications to manage pain and blood pressure, reading glasses that seem to multiply by the week. Every movement is calculated, every activity filtered through the question: will this help or hurt? But it's the evenings that tell the real story of who Simon has become. Bike rides with Eric along Malibu's coast, piano lessons where patient hands guide eager fingers, bedtime stories read with eyes that strain but hearts that soar. These have become the strongest medicine, the truest measure of wealth. His empire still generates enormous revenue. Franchises like Got Talent continuing to dominate global television, a fortune estimated at over $600 million, properties spanning from Malibu to London to Manhattan. But Simon speaks of these riches with detachment, almost indifference. He's already drafted his will. Eric won't inherit billions. Instead, the money will flow into foundations for children's health care, creative education, scholarships for disadvantaged youth. I don't want Eric to inherit money, Simon has said. I want him to inherit values. The legacy of scars. The Simon Cowell of 2025 is a man utterly transformed by survival, scars, and sober reflection. His verdicts have softened into counsel, his wit into warmth, his sharp edges into something approaching wisdom. He still appears on Got Talent, but the role is different now. Where once he wielded his critiques like weapons, now he offers them like gifts. Honest assessments wrapped in understanding. That dreams are fragile things, deserving of respect even when they can't be realized. His appearance tells its own story. The era of cosmetic enhancement is over, replaced by the honest face of a man who's learned that the greatest beauty isn't in hiding from time, but in accepting what it teaches. Each wrinkle is a mark of survival, each gray hair a badge of endurance. But perhaps the truest measure of who Simon has become lies not in what he's achieved, but in what he's learned to value. The ordinary victories now matter most. Reading bedtime stories under dimmed lamps, stretching each morning against persistent pain, directing his fortune toward children who will never know his name. The ruthless judge has become the humbled mentor. The empire builder has become a man of legacy. The boy who once felt invisible has learned that the most important audience is often an audience of one. The child who calls you dad, who loves you not for your achievements but for your presence. who teaches you that the greatest success isn't in being seen by millions, but in truly seeing the few who matter most. The truth behind the throne. So what do we make of Simon Cowell's story? How do we reconcile the man who gave us some of television's most memorable moments with the broken child who just wanted his father to say he was proud? How do we balance the empire builder with the man who nearly lost everything to his own ambitions? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that Simon's story was never really about talent shows or record deals or global fame. It was about the universal human need to matter, to be seen, to leave some mark on the world that proves we were here. The boy who felt invisible became impossible to ignore. The child starved of affection became a man who fed millions of dreams. The son who never heard "I'm proud of you" became a father who says it every day. But the cost was enormous. Every triumph came with sacrifice. Every success demanded a price. Every moment in the spotlight cast deeper shadows in his private life. Today, at 65, scarred by accidents and softened by loss, Simon Cowell offers us something more valuable than entertainment. A lesson in what it means to be human. Flawed, fragile, fighting every day to become something better than what we were yesterday. His legacy isn't really the shows he created or the stars he discovered. It's the reminder that behind every harsh critique was a broken child seeking approval. Behind every empire was a man running from invisibility. Behind every moment of seeming cruelty was someone who cared too much to lie. The greatest tragedy of Simon Cowell's story isn't that he was too harsh or too honest or too demanding. It's that it took him 65 years to learn what his son taught him in an instant. That love doesn't have to be earned, approval doesn't have to be sought, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present for someone who needs you. In the end, maybe that's the real truth behind the throne. That power without love is just noise, that success without connection is just emptiness, and that the harshest judge of all is often the voice inside our own heads, whispering the words our fathers never said. Simon Cowell's story continues not in television studios or boardrooms, but in quiet moments with a little boy who loves him unconditionally. And perhaps that's the most powerful ending of all. The man who spent his life seeking approval finally finding it in the eyes of someone who gives it freely. The invisible boy became impossible to ignore. But more importantly, he became impossible to forget. Not for his cruelty, but for his courage. Not for his power, but for his pain. Not for his empire, but for his endurance. And in that transformation lies the lesson for all of us. That our greatest strength often grows from our deepest wounds, that our most important victories come from our most devastating defeats, and that sometimes the longest journey we'll ever take is the one from who we were to who we're meant to become. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson will you take from Simon's journey? Will you slow down before life forces you to? Will you choose presence over power? Will you say the words someone needs to hear before it's too late? Subscribe for more stories that reveal the humanity behind the headlines, the broken hearts behind the powerful facades, the truth that fame can never fix what love can heal in an instant. Because in the end, we're all just children looking for approval, adults seeking connection, humans hoping to matter. And Simon Cowell's story reminds us that the greatest tragedy isn't in failing to achieve our dreams. It's in achieving them while losing ourselves along the way. The man who gave the world its most memorable no has finally learned to say yes to what matters most. And that might be the most powerful verdict of all.